December 1944. The snow was supposed to be their ally. The Germans thought it would slow the Americans, freeze the engines, blind the pilots. Instead, it became their grave. The Ardennes forest lay buried under white silence when the first shells broke through the morning. German artillery roared from the tree line, 88mm guns spitting fire across the frozen valley. Men of the U.S. Third Army hit the ground, helmets ringing like church bells. In the distance, tanks burned orange against the snow. When somewhere amid that storm, General George S. Patton stood watching the smoke rise. He didn't wait for permission. He never did. Patton's army had been moving north for 3 days straight, across ice, sleet, and wind so brutal it cracked rifle bolts. He'd promised to reach Bastogne, the trapped town at the heart of Hitler's last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. To his men, it sounded impossible. To Patton, it was destiny. "Get me Bastogne," he barked to his corps commanders, "and don't tell me the snow's too deep." "Hell, we'll use it to bury them." Every soldier who heard him swore his eyes burned brighter than the snow itself. The Germans had struck with 200,000 men. It was Hitler's desperate attempt to split the Allied lines, seize Antwerp, and force a truce before the Red Army swallowed Berlin. American divisions caught in the initial assault, like the 106th Infantry, were shattered. Bastogne, held by the 101st Airborne, was surrounded and choking under artillery fire. Eisenhower needed a miracle. Patton said he already had one. 3 days earlier, at a strategy meeting in Verdun, while other generals argued about logistics, Patton stunned them all. "I can turn my entire army 90 degrees and strike north within 48 hours, he said. The room went silent. Someone muttered it was impossible in winter conditions. Patton leaned forward, his voice low. "Improbable, maybe. Impossible, never." He'd already prepared the orders before the meeting began. By December 22nd, columns of Sherman tanks crawled through snow-packed roads, engines howling like beasts in pain. Soldiers huddled on the fenders, frost biting their faces. Every few miles they passed wrecked American vehicles, blackened from ambushes. Yet morale rose, not because conditions improved, but because Patton was moving. Word spread along the line like gospel. Old blood and guts is coming. To the Germans, that name meant trouble. To his men, it meant survival. At night, when the wind screamed across the hills, some soldiers swore they could hear Patton's voice over the radio waves. Short, sharp, uncompromising, keep moving. The quicker we move, the less they shoot. On Christmas Eve, the sky turned red over Bastogne. The Luftwaffe bombed the perimeter, while German tanks advanced through the fog. Inside the encircled town, paratroopers of the 101st fought from house to house. They had no winter coats, little ammunition, and almost no hope. Then the word came from the south. Patton's boys are close. What no one outside his staff knew was the cost. The march north was breaking men and machines. Fuel froze in the lines. Half-tracks slid into ditches and never came out. Medics treated frostbite with morphine because there was no time for proper bandages. Still, Patton pushed harder. He believed momentum itself could crush the enemy. One of his aides wrote later, "He was like a man possessed. Every map, every phone call, every prayer aimed at Bastogne." And yes, prayer. Just days before, Patton had ordered the Third Army chaplain to write a weather prayer. He wanted clear skies for air support. When the chaplain hesitated, "Sir, it'll take an act of God to stop this storm," Patton smiled. "Then we'll ask him properly." The next morning, the clouds broke. Blue sky. P-47 Thunderbolts roared overhead, strafing German convoys caught in the open. Patton looked up and muttered, "That's my kind of miracle." By December 26th, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division punched through German lines south of Bastogne. When their tanks met the paratroopers at the edge of town, the two forces embraced like brothers. One sergeant said, "We thought we were done for." The tanker beside him just grinned. "You can thank the old man." But Patton wasn't satisfied. He wanted the Germans not just beaten, but bled dry. He turned the offensive westward, counterattacking with fury. Every hill, every crossroads became a contest of will. And that's when the phrase took root among his troops. The day Patton turned the snow red. Because that's exactly what the battlefield looked like. German accounts from the period tell the same story from the other side. Panzer grenadiers in white camouflage wrote of American artillery so relentless it seemed to come from everywhere. Tanks appeared out of the fog, firing point blank. Corpses froze where they fell, their blood spreading across the snow like paint. By January 3rd, 1945, the German push had collapsed. Patton's Third Army had advanced over 100 miles through the worst winter Europe had seen in decades. The cost was staggering, tens of thousands dead or wounded, but the line held. The Bulge was broken. Eisenhower later said that no single maneuver in the Western Front had turned the tide of the war more decisively. Patton didn't boast. He simply said, "We caught them with their pants down and froze them that way." For Patton, Bastogne was more than a victory. It was proof that speed, audacity, and faith could bend reality itself. He believed war rewarded motion, punished hesitation. And in those frozen weeks when the world thought Hitler might still win, George S. Patton proved that an army and a nation could move faster than fear. Yet he also knew what the cost looked like. Driving past the battlefield after the fight, he saw the wreckage. Burned tanks half buried in drifts, rifles still clutched in icy hands. He removed his gloves, made the sign of the cross, and whispered something no one caught. The chaplain beside him swore he heard the words, "God forgive us for what we must do to end this." The Battle of the Bulge ended, but for Patton, the war never really stopped. He once told an aide, "All my life I've wanted to fight the enemy who could truly challenge me. Now that I've found him, they tell me I must stop." But history doesn't forget the day he refused to stop. The day his army marched through the storm, defied the impossible, and left a trail of red in the snow. That was the day General George S. Patton turned the snow red on the Germans. When the guns finally fell silent around Bastogne, the snow was no longer white. It was streaked with ash, oil, and blood. A frozen mosaic of what victory costs. Patton's tanks had carved a corridor through hell, but he didn't stop to admire it. He climbed into his Jeep, lit another cigarette, and ordered the engines north. There were still Germans to chase, and he wasn't a man who left a fight unfinished. To the men who followed him, Patton was equal parts genius and madman. He never seemed to sleep, rarely ate, and spoke in clipped bursts of fire. He demanded reports by the hour, movement by the minute, and obedience without question. If a convoy was delayed, he'd call directly and shout, "If your trucks aren't in motion, you're part of the enemy." His staff learned that Patton didn't believe in waiting, only in momentum. He saw war as a storm that rewarded the fastest hands and punished hesitation. He didn't just fight battles, he outpaced them. When Eisenhower's headquarters radioed to congratulate him on breaking the Bastogne siege, Patton's reply was simple: "We're not done yet." Even Eisenhower, calm, diplomatic, always cautious, admitted privately that Patton was the most dangerous man on the Western Front. Dangerous not because he disobeyed orders, but because he moved before anyone else had time to think. In private, Patton was both believer and blasphemer, a paradox made of contradictions. He carried a Bible in his jacket and cursed like a soldier in the next breath. He quoted scripture one moment, Roman history the next. To him, Alexander the Great and the Book of Psalms lived side by side. He often told his aides he had lived many lives, that he'd fought as a Roman legionary, a Napoleonic officer, even a medieval knight. It wasn't arrogance, it was conviction, the belief that destiny itself had chosen him for this war. That conviction made him clash with nearly everyone above him. Eisenhower respected him but feared his temper. Montgomery, the British field marshal, despised him, and the feeling was mutual. Where Monty planned, Patton charged. Where Monty paused for logistics, Patton already had tanks rolling. When reporters once asked him if he liked working with the British, Patton smirked. "I'd rather fight alongside them than against them, but I'd rather fight with them after they've started." His men loved it. The brass didn't. In those bitter January days of 1945, when his army pursued retreating German divisions toward the Siegfried Line, Patton began to change. The fury that had carried him through Sicily, France, and the Bulge started to give way to something heavier: reflection. He'd seen too many boys die under his orders, too many letters written home, too many towns liberated only to find the civilians gone. One night, while driving through Luxembourg, his jeep stopped by a small church still standing among the ruins. He went inside alone. The only light came from a broken stained glass window and the flicker of a single candle. He knelt down and prayed, not for victory, but for forgiveness. His aide, Colonel Codman, later said it was the first time he saw Patton cry. When Codman asked him afterward what he'd said to God, Patton's answer was quiet. "I told him to forgive me for loving it so much." That line never made it into official history, but the men who heard it never forgot. Even as winter raged, Patton's Third Army kept advancing. Every bridge was frozen, every river mined, every road shelled. But the momentum didn't break. Engineers threw planks across ice, infantry cleared minefields by hand, and tanks rolled forward like iron ghosts. When supply trucks ran out of gasoline, Patton ordered captured German fuel depots seized and drained. He didn't care about the paperwork. He cared about movement. By mid-January, his forces linked with Montgomery's in the north, closing the jaws of the Bulge. The German dream of splitting the Allies had become a nightmare of encirclement. Reports came in from captured officers who still couldn't understand how it had happened. "We thought the snow would stop you," one said. Patton's reply was cold. "We used it to hide the tracks of your retreat." But behind the swagger, the medals, and the profanity, there was something else, a loneliness that no victory could erase. Patton was adored by his soldiers, but distrusted by his superiors. He knew it, and it burned him. He once confided to a chaplain, "They need me to win the war, but fear what I'll do after." He wasn't wrong. Eisenhower valued Patton's fire, but dreaded his outbursts. The slapping incident in Sicily had scarred his reputation. One more controversy, and Washington would cut him loose. That fear made Patton's victories bittersweet. He could win battles, maybe even wars, but he could never win peace with the politicians above him. Still, he pushed on. For him, history was the only judge that mattered. He didn't fight for medals or fame. He fought to carve his name beside Alexander and Caesar. He once told a reporter, "All men are afraid in battle. The coward is the one who lets that fear control him. The hero uses it, drives it into the enemy." It was his creed and his curse. By February 1945, the German army was broken. The Ardennes offensive had consumed the last of their reserves. Fuel was gone. Ammunition scarce, morale shattered. Patton's divisions crossed into western Germany like a tide that couldn't be held back. He called it hunting season. Cities like Trier and Koblenz fell in days. German prisoners lined the roads by the tens of thousands. And through it all, Patton kept moving north and east, always demanding more speed. Eisenhower began slowing him down, redirecting fuel to Montgomery's forces. Patton raged in private, calling it a victory strangled by caution. But even slowed, he achieved what few thought possible: crossing the Saar, smashing through the Siegfried Line, and entering Germany's industrial heartland before spring. The Germans feared him more than any other Allied general. Captured field reports referred to him as Der Blitzgeneral, the Lightning General. To them, Patton wasn't a man, he was a storm given orders. By April, the war's end was near. Hitler's empire was collapsing, and the Allies stood on the Rhine. But for Patton, triumph tasted hollow. He'd seen camps, real ones, where the air smelled of ash and the ground of death. He'd seen what men could do when they believed too strongly in the wrong cause. And for a man who believed destiny guided him, that vision shook something deep inside. He told his aide one night, "If there's a hell, I hope they have room for men like these, and for men like me." He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a weapon forged for a single purpose. And when that purpose was gone, what was left? As Germany fell, Eisenhower reassigned Patton to govern Bavaria. For a man who lived to fight, paperwork was torture. He complained that he was now guarding sheep instead of killing wolves. He defied orders, spoke too freely, and soon found himself isolated again. But he never regretted the war, only that it had to end. On a cold December morning in 1945, almost exactly 1 year after the Battle of the Bulge, his car skidded off the road near Mannheim. Patton was thrown forward, breaking his neck. He never walked again. 12 days later, the man who moved armies faster than history itself was gone. He was buried among his men in Luxembourg, the same fields his tanks had saved. A simple white cross marks his grave. Even in death, Patton faced east toward Germany, because even when the war ended, his eyes never stopped looking toward the next battle. For decades, historians argued about him. Was he reckless or brilliant, cruel or courageous? The answer lies somewhere between, in the space where genius meets obsession. Patton turned the tide not just through tactics, but through belief. He taught his men to conquer fear, to move when others froze, and to act when others doubted. He proved that leadership isn't born from comfort. It's forged in chaos. When future generals studied his campaign, they didn't just learn logistics or maneuvers. They learned psychology, the art of making men believe the impossible could be done. And in December 1944, when Hitler's army thought winter had crippled the Allies, Patton's faith turned the snow red, not with defeat, but with the price of freedom. To this day, the old veterans who served under him remember not his medals or speeches, but the sight of his jeep, headlights cutting through the snow, the general standing tall in the freezing wind, as if daring God himself to try and stop him. That was Patton's gift, that was his curse, and that was his war. The snow melted, but Patton's war never did. Even when the shooting stopped, he couldn't. His mind was still in motion, replaying every charge, every order, every mistake that left a man frozen in that white hell. Europe was quiet now, but inside him there was still artillery fire. He told one of his aides that peace felt wrong, like waiting for a train that would never come. After Germany's surrender, the Allies divided the country into zones. Eisenhower wanted stability. The Soviets wanted revenge. Patton wanted neither. He wanted to prepare for the next war. He looked east toward Russia and saw another storm brewing. "We fought the wrong damn enemy," he said more than once, and that alone made Washington nervous. The brass wanted him to be a diplomat, a governor, a smiling symbol of American victory. But Patton wasn't built for smiles. He wasn't a man of peace. He was a man who only knew motion, and peace meant standing still. When reporters asked him about working with the Soviets, he didn't hide his disgust. "We defeated the Nazis, but we let the communists take over half of Europe," he said. "If we don't watch it, we'll have to fight them too." Those words made headlines and enemies. Eisenhower, now the supreme commander, read the transcripts and shook his head. He respected Patton, but he couldn't let one man risk the fragile alliance holding Europe together. "George," he told him, "you have to stop talking like that." Patton just stared back. If I stop talking, Ike, someone else will have to start fighting. His staff could feel it, the isolation creeping in. The same man who once commanded hundreds of thousands now sat behind a desk signing paperwork. He inspected rations, authorized civilian permits, listened to politicians lecture him on diplomacy. He despised every minute of it. "This isn't soldiering," he told one of his aides. "This is babysitting the ashes of what we burned." In private, he wrote letters to his wife Beatrice, long, restless letters that read like confessions. He told her the victory felt empty, that he missed the clarity of battle, that maybe he was born in the wrong century. In peace, he wrote, "I am useless. All I know is war." Rumors started swirling in Washington. They said Patton had lost control, that he couldn't adapt, that he was becoming a liability. But the men who'd fought under him didn't see madness. They saw a general betrayed by his own success. He'd given everything for victory, and now victory was all he had left. Then came the incident in Bavaria. Patton gave a speech to the press calling the Nazis like any other political party and arguing that punishing every German would destroy the country's future. His words were twisted. Headlines painted him as sympathetic to the very enemy he'd crushed. He tried to explain, saying, "We cannot fight communism if we destroy Germany first." But the damage was done. Washington had made its decision. He was quietly relieved of command. No fanfare, no ceremony, just a quiet reassignment that felt like exile. Patton took it with the same pride he carried into battle, but inside, he knew what it meant. The war had made him a legend. Peace had made him disposable. By December 1945, he was preparing to return home. He wanted to retire, write his memoirs, maybe speak to cadets who still believed in honor and courage. On the morning of December 9th, he set out for a hunting trip near Mannheim with his chief of staff, General Hobart Gay. It was cold, quiet, the kind of morning that reminded him of the Ardennes. The road was slick with frost. Their Cadillac staff car moved fast, too fast for the narrow lane. Ahead, a U.S. Army truck turned unexpectedly. The driver tried to brake, but it was too late. The crash wasn't violent, not by wartime standards. No explosions, no fire, just twisted metal and silence. Gay stumbled out with minor injuries. Patton didn't. The impact had thrown him forward, snapping his neck. He was conscious, but couldn't move. Lying there, he whispered, "I think I'm paralyzed." When they lifted him onto a stretcher, he muttered, "This is a hell of a way to die." In the hospital at Heidelberg, doctors did everything they could, but the damage was final. The man who led armies across continents couldn't move a finger. Friends came to visit, Eisenhower, Bradley, old comrades, but Patton seemed distant, already halfway gone. "I'd rather die in battle," he told Ike. "At least that would make sense." He lasted 12 days. On December 21st, 1945, the heartbeat that had carried the Third Army through the snows of Europe finally stopped. The world moved on. Newspapers printed polite obituaries. Washington issued statements. But for the soldiers who had marched under his command, it felt like something deeper had died. The fire that made men believe the impossible could be done. They buried him in Luxembourg, beside his men, among the same fields where the snow once ran red. No parade, no orchestra, just the wind moving through the graves and the faint echo of engines that would never start again. His headstone was simple, just his name, his rank, and his wars. And yet standing there, you could almost feel him watching, impatient, restless, ready for another fight. Because for Patton, death wasn't an ending, it was another campaign. The final one. Years later, Eisenhower said, "He was our best field commander and perhaps our hardest man to control." Bradley called him a genius wrapped in chaos. And the men who served under him said something simpler. He made us believe. That was Patton's true weapon, not tanks, not guns, not strategy. Belief, the power to make men charge through snow, through fear, through hell itself, because they trusted one voice more than the sound of their own heartbeat. History will always debate him. Some call him a hero, others a tyrant. Some say he was destined, others that he was doomed. But every December, when veterans gather in the cold and the snow begins to fall, they tell the same story about the man who refused to wait, who refused to surrender, who turned winter itself into a weapon, the man who turned the snow red on the Germans. There were whispers even before he was buried, whispers that his death wasn't an accident. Men who had fought beside him, men who had driven those same roads, said the crash didn't make sense. The Cadillac was barely dented. The truck driver was unhurt. Patton alone took the blow like fate itself had reached through the windshield and snapped his neck. Some said the Soviets wanted him gone. Others said Washington had finally decided he'd said too much. Patton had made enemies in every direction, politicians, generals, even allies who feared what he might say next. He'd seen too much, spoken too loudly, and believed too fiercely that peace with Moscow was a mistake. In the years that followed, journalists and historians dug through reports, autopsy notes, and classified files. They found inconsistencies, missing photographs, conflicting testimonies, and a quiet order to cremate his personal effects. Officially, it was a tragic accident. Unofficially, it was a wound history never closed. His wife, Beatrice, never believed the conspiracies. She said George lived by the sword and died by it, even if it wasn't on the battlefield. But those who knew him best weren't so sure. Patton had predicted his own death more than once. In letters home, he'd written, "I'll probably die in some ridiculous way. But if I do, remember that I lived exactly how I wanted." For the men who served under him, that prophecy became unbearable truth. They didn't need to read the reports to know what he meant. Patton was a man too dangerous for peace, too loud for politics, too alive for quiet, the kind of man history uses, then discards. In the decades that followed, his legend only grew. Hollywood turned him into an icon, the ivory-handled pistols, the polished helmet, the booming speeches, but the real Patton was far more complicated. He wasn't a caricature of rage. He was a scholar of war. He read Caesar, Napoleon, and the Bible with the same intensity he studied maps. He didn't fight for glory. He fought because he believed the battlefield revealed truth. He once said, "Compared to war, all other forms of human endeavor shrink to insignificance." It wasn't bravado. It was belief. In his mind, peace was the illusion, and war was the only place where men showed their souls. That belief terrified the world after 1945. A world trying to rebuild couldn't afford a man who still believed in fighting. But time changes nothing about the essence of men like him. The same willpower that drove his tanks through blizzards still echoes in the halls of West Point. His tactics are studied. His quotes are engraved. His name is still spoken with a mixture of awe and unease. And yet, behind all the legend and myth, there was always that one frozen winter, the snow, the silence before the storm, the order no one thought possible, to turn an entire army around in the middle of a blizzard and strike into the jaws of the enemy. That moment became the measure of him. Every story, every rumor, every debate about his legacy comes back to that single act of defiance. It wasn't the medals or the speeches that defined him. It was the choice to move when the world said, "Stop." The old veterans who remember those days don't argue about politics or conspiracy. They remember the sound of his voice cutting through static on the radio, the words that pushed them forward when their strength was gone. They remember the man who refused to let winter win. He wasn't perfect. He was cruel at times, reckless at others, but he was real, raw, relentless, and unafraid. He believed men could rise above fear, that courage wasn't the absence of terror, but the mastery of it. And on that frozen front, when everything seemed lost, that belief carried thousands through the storm. That's why they still talk about him, Bont. Not because of how he died, but because of how he lived. Because when history itself froze, George S. Patton kept moving. He moved through the snow, through the fire, through the doubt of every man who said it couldn't be done. He moved until the sky broke open, until the engines roared, until the snow turned red and the war turned. And in that red snow, a truth was written that no conspiracy or rumor could ever erase. Some men command armies, others command time. Patton did both. Even now, when the wind howls across the Ardennes and the world forgets how close it came to losing, there's a whisper that rides the cold, the sound of engines in the distance, and a voice hard as steel shouting above the storm. Even decades after the war, his presence never left the battlefield. You could see it in the way American generals studied their maps, the way they demanded speed, precision, audacity. They called it shock and maneuver, but it was Patton's doctrine dressed in new language. When tanks rolled across Kuwait in 1991, when armored columns thundered through Iraq in 2003, it was his voice echoing through history. Attack, keep going, never stop. He'd been dead for half a century, but his fingerprints were everywhere. The spirit of relentless offense, the belief that hesitation was death, the idea that victory belonged to the bold, all of it came from him. The soldiers who trained under his system became the backbone of the modern U.S. Army. They carried his gospel across generations, often without even realizing it. Patton had once said, "Wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men." And that line outlived him. It became a truth passed down through every officer's school and every battlefield briefing. He understood something timeless, that technology changes, but courage doesn't. In the years after his death, as the Cold War began to shadow Europe, his warnings started to sound prophetic. He'd seen the rise of the Soviet machine before anyone else wanted to admit it. He'd warned that Stalin would not stop, that Europe would trade one tyranny for another. He'd begged Washington to prepare, to stand firm, to stay ready. They called him paranoid then. History called him right. Every generation that followed learned the same hard lesson he knew too well, that peace isn't the absence of war, it's the preparation for the next one. And in that truth, Patton's ghost lived on. But beyond the strategy and steel, there was something human about the man that even his harshest critics couldn't deny. He loved his soldiers like sons and demanded of them what he demanded of himself, everything. He walked among the wounded, spoke to them by name, handed out medals with tears still drying on his face. To some he was cruel, to others inspiring, but to all unforgettable. He wasn't made for comfort. He wasn't made for compromise. He was made for motion, forged by chaos and broken by peace. And maybe that's why his story still haunts every man who's ever worn a uniform. Because deep down, every soldier knows the truth Patton lived by, that war reveals what peace hides. When you look back at the old black and white photos, the tanks in the snow, the flags flapping in frozen wind, you can almost feel his presence behind them, not as a distant general, but as a force of will. He wasn't just leading men, he was dragging history forward. Some called him insane, some called him divine, but all of them followed. And that, in the end, is the definition of leadership, to make men move when everything in them screams to stop. That's why, even now, when the snow falls across Europe and the wind carries the faint echo of engines, there's still a sense that Patton never really left. That somewhere, in that frozen silence, the man who turned the snow red is still out there, waiting for another fight, another chance to prove that courage and conviction can bend even the coldest fate. Because men like him don't die. They linger in memory, in doctrine, in the sound of boots crunching over frost. They live in every soldier who looks at the impossible and says, "Move." And maybe that's the lesson he left behind. Not that victory is glorious or that war is noble, but that courage, real courage, is motion in the face of despair. It's the act of standing up when the world has fallen still. Patton once wrote, "It is foolish and wrong to mourn the men who died. Rather, we should thank God that such men lived. The same could be said of him. He was not perfect, he was not gentle, but he was necessary. And as long as there are wars to be fought, as long as there are men standing in the snow wondering if they can take one more step, the answer will always be the same. The echo of that old command, the heartbeat of a man who refused to stop. Keep moving. The world moved on, but ghosts like him never fade quietly. They linger in the cracks of history, in the sound of marching boots, in the quiet between radio transmissions, in the heartbeat of every soldier who stands where he once stood. Sometimes in the dead of winter, when Europe lies frozen and still, old veterans say they can feel him, not see him, but feel him, a presence that cuts through the cold, a whisper that rides the wind over the Ardennes. Keep moving, it says, the same words that carried an army through blizzards and fire. The world has changed since then. The weapons are different. The politics are colder. But the spirit that Patton embodied, unyielding, unrelenting, unafraid, still burns in the hearts of those who refuse to surrender. He was a man built for one purpose, to fight. And yet what he truly fought wasn't the Germans or even the war itself. It was time, the unstoppable march of it, the silence that comes after the noise, the stillness that follows victory. For all his fury, for all his fire, Patton feared only one thing, that history would forget the men who froze, bled, and died beside him, that one day their courage would be reduced to paragraphs and statistics, that the sound of engines would fade from memory. But history didn't forget. It couldn't, because every December when the snow falls over Bastogne, the ground still remembers. Beneath that quiet white sheet lie the echoes of gunfire, the shouts of men, the roar of tanks. And somewhere in that frozen earth lies the spirit of the general who refused to stop. He didn't believe in luck. He believed in will. He believed that courage was contagious, that one man's determination could ignite thousands. And maybe that's why his legend endures, not because he was flawless, but because he was human enough to burn for something greater than himself. Patton's story isn't just about war, it's about motion, about refusing to die standing still, about the belief that even when everything freezes around you, there's still a way forward if you dare to move. He was many things, hero, sinner, soldier, myth, but above all, he was proof that history doesn't belong to the cautious. It belongs to the relentless. And so, when the winter wind sweeps across those old battlefields, it carries more than snow. It carries the memory of a man who stood against the impossible and made it yield. Somewhere out there in that endless silence, you can still hear it. The echo of treads, the hum of engines, the rhythm of a heartbeat that refused to stop. Patton is gone, but the snow still remembers. And if you listen long enough, you'll realize it isn't just memory you're hearing, it's defiance. The kind that only men like him leave behind, the kind that doesn't fade when the guns fall silent. It lingers, quiet but unbreakable, in the soil, in the steel, in the men who came after. Every generation finds its own battles, its own enemies, its own cold. But somewhere inside each fight, there's a spark of him, the impatience with hesitation, the hatred of excuses, the belief that courage isn't a feeling, it's an action. The world he left behind became one of alliances, bureaucracy, and half measures, the kind of world he would have despised. Yet even within it, his shadow stretched long. His ideas shaped armies, inspired doctrines, terrified enemies. The Soviets studied him as much as the Americans did. They called him the ghost general, the man who refused to die, the spirit that haunted their war games. Because Patton wasn't just a man, he was momentum given flesh. Every command, every glare, every curse was gravity pulling history forward. He didn't wait for the world to make sense. He forced it to, and when it didn't bend fast enough, he broke it. The men who served under him grew old. Their hair turned white, their medals gathered dust. but when they spoke of him, their eyes still lit up, the same way they had in the snow. They didn't talk about his speeches or his temper. They talked about the moment he arrived, the sound of engines when hope was gone, the impossible order that became salvation. To them, Patton wasn't a memory. He was proof that one man's will could alter the course of a war. That belief, even madness in the right hands, could reshape destiny. And maybe that's why his story still resonates, not just with soldiers, but with anyone who's ever stood at the edge of failure and refused to fall. Because in the end, Patton's war wasn't about conquest, it was about conviction. He believed that fear was the enemy. That hesitation killed faster than bullets. That motion, pure, unstoppable motion, was life itself. When he looked across a battlefield, he didn't see death. He saw the test, the measure of who we really are when the world collapses around us. That's what he taught. That's what he left behind. And though time has buried his body and rewritten his wars, it has never buried his fire. You can feel it in every act of courage, every refusal to surrender, every moment when someone keeps going despite the odds. That's where Patton lives now, not in the past, but in every heartbeat that refuses to stop. Because war ends, empires crumble, names fade, but will never dies. And his was a will the world could not contain. So when the snow falls again over Europe and the skies go quiet and the world feels cold and uncertain, remember this. There was once a man who looked at that same silence and dared it to move. And somehow it did. The engines started, the tanks rolled, the frozen ground shook, and history changed forever. That's the legacy of General George S. Patton, a man who refused to slow down even when the world demanded it. A man who fought the impossible and won. A man who turned the snow red and never looked back. Because legends don't rest. They wait for the next storm, for the next impossible order, for the next man brave enough to move. Keep moving. When the war ended, Europe tried to rebuild, but the damage ran deeper than anyone wanted to admit. Patton's campaigns became military textbooks, studied by every officer who came after him. His methods, fast, aggressive, uncompromising, shaped how modern wars would be fought for generations. To his soldiers, he was the general who never asked for what he wouldn't do himself. To his enemies, he was the storm they could never stop. To Washington, he was the man they couldn't control. He wasn't perfect. He broke rules, he broke men, and he broke himself trying to chase something only he could see. But no one who followed him ever doubted what he stood for. He wanted victory, not excuses. Progress, not speeches. Results, not politics. After his death, the world turned toward peace. But in every military academy, in every command briefing, his words still surface. The belief that the best defense is speed, that hesitation is death, that an army is only as strong as its will to keep advancing. He once said, "Wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men." That line was true when he said it, and it's true now. General George S. Patton didn't just lead soldiers, he turned them into believers. And in that frozen winter of 1944, when the world thought it had reached its breaking point, he proved that one man's will could turn the tide of history. That was his war. That was his legacy. General George S. Patton, America's relentless commander.